My name is Kate Mobley, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some interpretations of fairies in fiction. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at some um, Middle Ages literature, Victorian literature, and then some modern fiction, fantasy fiction, and fairies within these works. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly a fairy is. They are known as magical creatures from European folklore, but often nowadays we might think of fairy, small winged creatures, sort of like Tinkerbell. But actually in folklore, historically, fairies were seen as humanoid type creatures with magical abilities, ethereal appearances. Given that fairies exist across many different cultures, specifically European folklore, it's difficult to pin down one specific description because each of these cultures' folklore has influenced its interpretations of fairies, and many of these cultures have had their own terms to describe fairies, which made it difficult to find one specific cultural origin for these creatures. For example, there are the Scandinavian Alfar, which are sort of an elven, divine, semi-divine race, the Irish Ishi. They are, again, described as humanoid magical beings, mythical. And then there are the Scottish Dinashi, which are the Scottish interpretation of the Ishi, I'm sorry. This also, the term fairy can refer to one type of creature or a group of various mythical beings. For example, banshees, leprechauns, puka, all of these are once named fairy and belonging to the group of fairies, but and other times a fairy might just describe one specific type of creature that is humanoid in appearance. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, those humanoid fairies. They're also thought of being similar to the folkloric elf. Again, we see the connection between the Alfar of Norse mythology, and often the elves that we see in modern fantasy fiction are similar to what I call the humanoid fairies. So while there are different appearances and descriptions of these types of creatures across the cultures, there are still many similarities. For example, they are thought of as ethereal, otherworldly beings that inhabit a place separate from our own land, our own earth. This land is often called fairyland, the otherworld, Elfheim, Tir na Nog, this of the Irish mythology. And these creatures often kidnap or whisk away mortals to fairyland, where they live in a perpetual state of happiness, and they listen to the enchanting music of the fairies. But time passes differently in fairyland, and a mortal will often spend a short time in fairyland but realize that they have spent hundreds of years if they go back to earth. They're also prone to stealing babies, which plays into the changelings lore of the folklore belief that the fairies will swap mortal babies. And so there are many similarities across the cultures, which we will find now in the literature of fairies. So the first sort of instance of fairies coming into literature rather than just folklore are the Breton lays and other legendary stories. Breton lays are short romantic poems found in French and English medieval literature. They often include stories of fairies and fairyland. They are essentially chivalric romances. So they will often feature things of the Arthurian canon. For example, Morgan Le Fay, as denoted by her name, was said to be from or related to the fairies or from fairyland. Marie de France was one of the most popular authors of these Breton lays, and she wrote L'Envol, which is interesting because oftentimes in these chivalric romances, specifically of Arthurian canon, it features a knight rescuing a damsel in distress. But in L'Envol, there's actually a knight who is rescued by a fairy queen upon her horse. And this is interesting because it's a female author, and it's putting the female as the rescuer, which is most different from what is usually written about in these chivalric romances. And then there's also Sir Orfeo, by an anonymous author, again, another super popular Breton lay, which is an Orpheus retelling, where Sir Orfeo's wife is taken by a fairy king to fairyland, and Sir Orfeo has to travel into fairyland and get her back safely. This shows, again, the parallel of our world and then fairy world, fairyland, and mortals traveling within and coming back out. And then obviously we have A Midsummer Night's Dream, which features Oberon and Titania, the king and queen of the fairies. And these figures appear even now in fantasy fiction. Most people will know the names Oberon and Titania. They are very important, famous figures, and sort of popularized the notion of fairies in literature as well. So we move to the Victorian era. We have this woman, Lady Wilde, who's the mother of Oscar Wilde. She was a poet who focused a lot on Irish folk tales. So a few of her works, which are probably some of her more famous works, are Ethna the Bride, Fairy Music, The Fairy Dance, and A Dame the Queen. Many of these stories are going to follow the same sort of characteristics and have the same elements of the folkloric fairies. So, for example, within Ethna the Bride, a quote, "The fairies, as we know, are greatly attracted by the beauty of mortal women, and Finvar the king employs his numerous sprites to find out and carry off, when possible, the prettiest girls and brides in the country. These are spirited away by enchantment to his fairy palace at Nachma in Tuam, where they remain under a fairy spell, forgetting all about the earthly life and soothed to passive enjoyment, as in a sweet dream, by the soft, low melody of the fairy music, which has the power to lull the hearer into a trance of ecstasy." And then a quote from Fairy Music, "It is sometimes possible, by the spells of a powerful fairyman, to bring back a living being from fairyland, but they are never quite the same after. They always have a spirit look, especially if they have listened to the fairy music. For the fairy music is soft and low and plaintive, with a fatal charm for mortal ears." So here we see the elements of the fairy music enthralling the mortal listeners, and eventually to a point where these mortal people might be in fairyland or even just hear the music and be completely entranced by it. And this again points to the elements that I discussed earlier within the folklore of fairies, which shows the fairy music, the time passing by at abnormal times, very slow or very fast. And then we go to W.B. Yeats, who takes after Lady Wilde in the sense that he often wrote about the fairies and fairy lore and fairy tales. He was a 20th century Irish poet and writer, and Yeats distinguished between two types of fairies, the trooping and the solitary. Within Scottish myth, they describe fairies as either seelie or unseelie. Seelie is sort of a happier, more mischievous, lighter sort of fairy. And then the unseelie are the darker, the violent, perhaps even murderous fairies. And he distinguishes between the two of these because the trooping fairies are often thought of as traveling in a procession together. His most popular fairy work is probably The Wanderings of Oisin, which is an epic poem. And within The Wanderings of Oisin, it recounts the tale of legendary Irish poet Oisin and his adventures in Tir na Nog, or the Irish fairyland. Oisin lives in fairyland for 300 years after the fairy princess Nave falls in love and brings him to her home in fairyland. Oisin explores different islands of fairyland before returning home. He spent 300 years in Tir na Nog before wanting to return to see his comrades in Ireland. Nave tells him that he can return, but should not come down from his horse. And as he's back in Ireland, of course, as many of these stories play out, the saddle of his horse breaks and he falls to the ground, instantly aging 300 years. So we see again these elements of the time passing by differently, and this trope, this motif of a fairy bringing a mortal to their world, their fairyland, their Tir na Nog. Here's a quote from Nave. "O Oisin, mount by me and ride to shores by the wash of the tremulous tide, where men have heaped no burial mounds, and the days pass by like a wayward tune, where broken faith has never been known, and the blushes of first love never have flown. But here there is nor law nor rule, nor have hands held a weary tool, and here there is nor change nor death, but only kind and merry breath." So Nave describes Tir na Nog, fairyland, as a beautiful, bountiful, harmonious place, much separate from the earth and the violence, the death that a mortal might experience there. So some modern interpretations, they're all fairly similar if you break down a lot of what is being talked about of the fairy interpretation in modern day. Tales from the Hinterland is probably one of my favorite modern fairy tale collections. One of these stories follows a girl who stumbles upon a door that takes her to another world parallel to her own. We see fairyland parallel. Here she finds a group of masked men dancing who force her to dance with them. After dancing for what feels like hours, she tries to run away, but is chased by the men, eventually finding her way back to the door and to her real world, but is still haunted by the music when she sleeps. Not only does this hit on many elements of fairy stories, such as the parallel world, fairy music, abnormal passing of time, and seductive figures, but we can see a connection between this story and that of Lady Wilde's The Fairy Dance. In that story, a woman trips and falls to the ground, wherein she looks up and realizes she's in a strange new world, fairyland. Here there are a group of fairies, one of which invites her to dance and follow him to his palace. She is instructed by a figure in the palace to not eat or drink anything that the fairies offer her, and she complies. This angers the fairies, and they chase her back to her home, where she escapes from them but can still hear the music as they ride away. So we see a lot of parallels between Lady Wilde's story and this story from Tales from the Hinterland. And this shows up a lot because of the fact that the folklore of fairies is so cemented within Celtic culture, mostly also Germanic culture, but within the Celtic culture, that you're going to see the same elements show up in these modern retellings. And despite any personal opinions about the next work, A Court of Thorns and Roses, and about the subject matter of the series, which heavily features fairly graphic sex between its main characters, I'd like to focus on its overall depiction of fairies rather than its content. Similar to the folkloric elements of fairies, which I had previously described, the fairies within this series are given a sexual, ethereal description. Here's a quote from the first book describing an important character. This beast was not a man, not a lesser fairy. He was one of the high fae, one of their ruling nobility, beautiful, lethal, and merciless. His skin shimmered with veins of pure gold, iridescent like a blue butterfly. Here we see that while the fae are thought of as beautiful, there is an underlying sense of danger and the propensity for violence, which is very similar to the folk beliefs of fairies, given their nature to be volatile, easily angered, easily changed. And then last one I wanted to talk about was the Iron Fae series, which features a similar dichotomy of the summer, winter, seelie, unseelie, light, dark distinctions between fairies, specifically within the Scottish myth of the seelie and unseelie. And even how Yeats describes the trooping and solitary fairies. Also present in this series are characters from A Midsummer Night's Dream, like Puck and the Fairy King Oberon. So again, noting that characters like that from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream even show up now within modern day fiction. So while not every story describes the same type of creature when the author uses the term fairy, there are at least many similar elements that show up within these fairy stories, which shows how impactful folklore and tradition can be to a modern audience. Thank you.